Good evening, good morning. Hope everyone's doing all right. And welcome to another Bright News discussion with me, Shannon Braswell. And today I have with me Pastor Jim Fitzgerald. So today we're going to be talking about his work and his mission. So without further ado, Pastor Fitzgerald, how are you?
I'm doing great, Shannon. It's great to be with you today.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. So let's start out by talking a little bit about yourself and what it is you do, if that's okay.
Yeah, I'm with the Equipping Pastors International. We're a missions group that started out of our church in Oviedo, Florida, a suburb of Orlando. And we started out to try to reach many of the nations in Africa where people don't have access to biblical and theological education, especially on a high level or seminary level. My particular emphasis is in North Africa and the Middle East, but we have people, all over the continent of Africa. I've been myself to all the way up to the very tip of North Africa and Tunisia, all the way at the very bottom of in South Africa. Been to West Africa and spent a considerable amount of time in East Africa as well.
Okay. And with that experience, I mean, can you tell me a little bit more about like what is the experience being sort of in those particular regions, right? I mean, because we know that Africa is what, the second largest continent or something like that. So
Yeah,
it's pretty vast. There's a lot of different, cultural.
yeah.
Cultural
There's a lot of differences culturally speaking. What I have found is that every nation in Africa, every country in Africa is different, and it requires different approaches, different methods. So it's a one size fits all approach doesn't work there. Across the whole continent, it's just too big, too diverse, and so what we try to do is we try to listen to the people on the ground. Obviously, we have a program, we have a project, we have a ministry, but we try to tailor make that ministry for the people on the ground according to what their needs are. And we're willing to adapt and change and morph, according to what we find on the ground as we're being advised and counseled by the people that live there, which I think is an important aspect. And, like I said, my main emphasis is in North Africa and the Middle East. I just got back from crisscrossing North Africa. I started out in Morocco and 2 cities in Morocco, in Casablanca and in Rabat. Then I went to Tunis in Tunisia, and then I went to Cairo in Egypt, and then I went all the way back across the country. So it's about a 6.5, 7 hour flight, just across, from Cairo to Casablanca or vice versa. It's similar to, crossing the Atlantic. If you were to leave New York and fly to Casablanca, it's still about a 7.5 hour trip on a good day. So, with the wind behind you, so, it's a huge continent. And not to mention, if you start going north and south on that continent, you're going to see a lot of different geographical changes, cultural changes. The governments and so forth. There's a lot of diversity there that you have to take into account when you're ministering on the continent of Africa.
Right. Okay. Well, I wanna maybe go back a little here in historically, right, and talk about the Christian in North Africa historically, right? I know that from what I've learned, that Christianity had a long-standing presence in North Africa before um, the well, maybe you can explain that a little more than
Yeah,
I don't remember which group.
sure.
Okay.
Yeah, so you're right. I mean, and the Christianity in North Africa dates back to the time of the apostles, where I minister. We use Egypt as our platform to reach across North Africa and then up into the Middle East. And tradition would say that the gospel writer Mark was the one who brought Christianity to Egypt, and also says that he was martyred there in Alexandria. But he also trained people and took people across North Africa, reaching many of the countries, heading westward from Egypt.
Right.
And then you have, different historical and ancient traditions there of Christianity. In Egypt, you have the Coptic Church, and then that spread both westwardly and to the south. One of the great men and church fathers of ancient Christianity is named Athanasius, and he took the gospel all the way down the Nile, all the way to Uganda. So it's really steeped. That whole area was steeped in Christianity. Right. I often like to refer to these countries in North Africa, and then even below in sub-Saharan Africa. I think of these as, in terms of their ancient identity, as Christian nations. Right. These were Christian powerhouses. Yeah. A lot of times we think, well, the West, America and Europe brought the gospel to Africa and converted the natives there. And of course, that's just not the way it happened. The West got the gospel from them. We didn't bring the gospel to them. Right. They gave it to us. We're just bringing it back around full circle. And so I like to think of these as Christian nations. North Africa was the intellectual and theological capital of the Christian world. I mean, this was the center of Christianity. There were something like 15 Egyptian bishops at the Council of Nicaea, which resulted in the Nicene Creed being written. Africans developed and sort of invented the idea of church councils. The idea of a church council is, an African idea. And so, these were the scholars of the day, and still today would be considered the best scholars, in Christianity. Their writings are still in existence today. We read them, we study them. They preserved the teachings of the apostles and gave us what today we consider Orthodox Christianity.
Right. Okay. And I know, for instance, St. Augustine, who was now we would call him a doctor of the church, something like that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Right.
He himself sort of, I guess there's been scholarly debate about this, but I think he himself identified as an African, as a what you would consider, what we call today Amazigh, right? It used to be the term Berber, but
right.
Now that I guess that's considered a derogatory term. Is that correct?
Yeah. Well, I just having come from Morocco, I know that Moroccans still would call themselves Berbers, but so I don't think there was any negative connotation there. And they may use a more local term as well to describe themselves. Augustine was from the Berbers. He did think of himself as an African, as all these people did. There was definitely influence from Rome and Greece and and other places, but they thought of themselves primarily as Africans. It's only really in modern times that people try to characterize that in a different way, as if they had some sort of self-identity in terms of, being more European or Latin or something like that. So, but I think their own self-consciousness was as an African.
Okay, great. Okay, so because Islam is very much entrenched into um, the culture, more so. How do I explain this? To someone who's coming from, say, a country like the United States, or say from Europe, you know, they might have a much more spiritual connection to Islam than a cultural one, right? Because they don't, not speaking Arabic or not having that long standing affiliation. So what are the challenges towards, reaching say people in North Africa, or people who have a long standing relationship with Islam, preaching the gospel to them, and helping them to understand that?
Yeah. Well, yeah, obviously, again, the way that I try to think about doing ministry there is that these were at one time all Christian nations, and their identity was as Christians for up and until the 7th century, when Islam started to arise and then conquer those regions. Of course, it took a lot longer before they could uniformly outlaw other languages and impose the language of Arabic on entire populations. So that takes hundreds of years before that's uniform across the board. So you still had Greek and Latin and Coptic as primary languages among the local peoples. Right. And so and then little by little that fades out and gets replaced by Arabic, both through legislative process, through the legal process, and through social pressure to conform. Okay. But you have to remember that this takes time. So first, what they would do is they would take over the big metropolis, the big cities, so Alexandria. But then it takes time, to get down to Cairo, and it takes a lot longer to get down to the villages, where people are farming the land and so forth. And those people change a lot slower than urban people do. Urban people tend to change rather quickly, but rural people change slowly. And so this takes a lot longer than most people think. And also it's indicative of two different strategies. I had mentioned Athanasius before, who had both urban and rural ministry. Right. But for instance, in Tunisia, where Augustine was, their emphasis was primarily urban. And this is interesting considering our modern context now, which has a big focus on urban ministry, which is fine, but we tend to neglect rural ministry. Right. And so I think that there's an important historical lesson here, in as much as that when Tunisia was conquered, when Carthage, ancient, this is Tunisia's ancient Carthage, when Carthage was conquered, it extinguished the ministry there almost immediately, because it was almost entirely urban, and coastal. Right. And so, but in Egypt, it took a lot longer, because, as I said before, Athanasius had taken the gospel all the way down the Nile, both urban and rural. And so all these farmers, it takes a lot longer to change their culture than it does to change an urban culture. Right. And so that, it's just sort of interesting strategically how we think about this going forward, and how we develop our ministerial strategies and so forth. Right. So what we have done is we've always tried to approach this, on two fronts. One, urban, going to the villages, showing them that, they are as important as, the urban elites, as it were, and to, incorporate them and to invite them and even bring them, if we're in an urban area, to bring them there. We bus people, we put people on trains, we bring people to wherever we are, and we also go there. Right. And so I think, strategically, that's an important thing to recognize, especially when so much emphasis in America and in the West these days has been on, going to the big cities, reaching the cities and so forth, which is important, but not to the neglect of rural areas. Right. The other thing is that I think the statistics, the demographics are somewhat misleading. Like since Islam came to places like, let's say, Egypt or whatever, which had Egypt had a substantial, Christian, their national identity was Christian. And so, and then after the inception of Islam there, we started talking about, Christianity only makes up 10% of the Egyptian population. And that statistic's been around for as long as Islam has. But I think it's misleading. I think, first of all, it took a long time to, Islamicize Egypt. The second thing is that even now, I would estimate the Christian population, when you consider all facets of Christianity, I would estimate that population to be at something like 25%, maybe 30%, 35%. So, because, there is evangelism going on, but when Muslims convert, they're not raising their hand and saying, "Oh, I just converted, sign me up." Right. It's a lot of this is under the radar. Nobody wants to advertise this,
Right. Right.
So, not healthy.
Well, speaking of that, I mean, is that sort of a concern for missionaries too? Going into places where there's a Muslim majority.
Yeah, I would. I mean, that has not been my experience, but I have found these countries largely to be, very hospitable. But of course, we don't go there as missionaries. We go there as tourists, or we go there as business people, and do ministry. Now, in most of these countries, there's nothing illegal about ministering to the church. In other words, we're free to do ministry with the church. We're not free to try to convert or proselytize Muslims. That's against the law. But there are very few laws that would, in these countries, that would restrict us from going in there and teaching Christians, and helping them get educated and so forth. So we're fairly free to do that. But nevertheless, when I go as a tourist, and I stay the length of my visa, and then I go. I have friends there that live there, but they have like businesses, like they teach English or something like this, and they have residency there based on their business or their school or something like that. I'd like to say one more thing about, when we're talking about the strategy and the culture and how we do this, because there's, not only, do you have the urban rural thing that you need to take into consideration, but you also, have the approach. Like, I know a lot of Christians go there and they say, because Islam doesn't embrace the Christian concept of the Trinity, the biblical concept of the Trinity. We believe in one God in three persons. Right. And so a lot of missionaries go there, and the strategy has been just tell them about Christ, just tell them about Jesus, and forget about the complexities of the Trinity, because you're sort of fighting uphill, as it were, if you take that approach. And I've taken issue with that myself. I think the Trinity is the issue, is the number one thing that we should be using as a tool to reach Islam. And I think it's an effective tool. And so we've recently just translated a book called On the Trinity by Professor Scott Swain, by Dr. Scott Swain, who is the president of Reformed Theological Seminary here in Orlando. And we're distributing that book, all through Egypt, all throughout North Africa, and all through the Middle East right now as we speak.
Okay. Wow. Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, I do believe it is quite complicated to, after I finish saying this, you could kind
Yeah,
of flush that out or something.
yeah,
Speaking about Islam in terms of its issue with the Trinity and its issue with the divinity of Christ, right? It's sort of I think the Quran sort of it's embedded in the Quran that this is sort of an issue, that Christ cannot be one, the Son of God. That's like blasphemy or something, and then
yeah, right.
say that, to say that uh Christ is divine, right, is sort of a, I guess that's that's confusing to them, and sometimes even for myself, being a Christian, I'm like, I could see why it would be confusing, because you start talking and then you're like, well, I'm kind of getting mixed up too now. I
Yeah,
don't really know,
sure,
I don't really know how to address that,
right.
uh, or they might say, well, all you have to do is just follow the law. That's what God wants you to do. Follow His law, follow His rules. And that's another question. I'm like, well, the Jews believe that too. Like, just follow the law, right? So um, maybe in terms of, I'm I'm asking these questions to you,
Sure,
without the missionary uh,
right, right.
element. I mean, maybe can you maybe give me some tips on how to address this?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I mean, obviously, it's complex. The idea of one God in three persons is complex. And what we quickly find out is that precision in language is very important. But remember, going back to the church fathers and Augustine, he wrote a book on the Trinity. That's the name of it. Which is this other book that I was talking about. This modern book is named sort of after that. It's on the Trinity. So these were issues that were going on. At the time that the church fathers were ministering, and they developed a language to articulate it very well, very clearly. And then the church sort of abandons that language, and then we get nervous talking about it because it doesn't take long. I mean, you can slip up real quick and get into heresy. We can, all can, I mean, you talk long enough about it, you're probably going to say some heresy.
Right. Right.
And so that's why we translated this little book to help us all out, and it's more about, staying within certain boundary lines,
Right.
and defining the terms so that, because look, Islam talks about this all the time, in a critical way. So
Right.
they're already talking about it.
Right.
It's not like we're introducing something that they're not talking about it.
Right.
We're trying to clarify their understanding of it because they're talking about it all the time.
Right.
I mean, that's one of the first things they want to talk about,
Right. Right.
And one of the things I appreciate about Muslims is, they don't shy away from discussing things, debating things,
Right.
arguing about things, and they're not easily offended about these things either.
Right.
They sort of enjoy that.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah.
Because they think they're right too.
Right. I remember listening to I don't know if you ever heard, Rene Girard.
Sure.
He said
Love them.
yeah, he said Christians want Muslims to be Christian just as much as Muslims want Christians to be Muslim.
Yep.
So
Exactly.
it's
That's
all
right.
we all have that within us, to sort of pull one to our side,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I think, yeah, it's important to do that in a peaceable way, and
Yeah. Sure.
that's true. I do agree with you that Muslims and even I would say even Jews tend to have sort of an embrace of debate and
Yeah.
conversation.
Yeah.
because it seems to be something that, like you said, goes all the way back to sort of, and late antiquity, where you have all these scholars and stuff that they're debating each other and writing, and oftentimes it was kind of like a rarely did they do engage in physical violence, but there was a lot of like schism, or
Sure,
like, I'm
sure.
gonna put you away, you can go over there, and I'll
Right,
I'll be over here,
right.
we'll see who we can convert and win over to our side, you know.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, I think that's an important way to approach these things.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. One of the things I always used to, tell my students here in America, I taught at a community college here, which eventually became a 4-year college here in Orlando called Valencia College. And I taught there for about 18 years, and we had a lot of international students. I had a sizable population of Muslim students from Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Egypt. I mean, you name it. I had students from all over the world, and I taught humanities there, and so and that is entwined with the subject of religion and so forth. And as you teach historically and go through the different periods of history, and and you get to the Islamic phase of history and so forth. And I would tell my students all the time, look, if I misrepresent your religion in any way, you can either just shout out, raise your hand, whatever you want to do, but feel free to correct me.
Right.
Because I'm not here to misrepresent your religion. But what I want to avoid is this sort of this blurry kind of idea that we all worship the same God.
Right.
So let's be clear about what Muslims believe, and let's be clear about what Christians believe.
Right.
And we can both be wrong,
Right.
but we can't both be right.
Right.
Right. So
yeah.
you believe that there's one God. His name is Allah. Okay.
Right.
And Allah has no sons. And anybody that says Allah has a son is going to spend eternity in hell.
Right.
Okay. He's damned for eternity.
Right.
Christians believe that there's one God in three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are co-equal and co-eternal. Right? That is, the Father is God, the Son is God, and the Holy Spirit is God. Not three gods, three persons, one God, but they're all divine.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Now, so that means the Christian God has a son, and anyone who says he doesn't have a son is damned for all eternity. Now, either God has a son or God doesn't have a son. Right. Right. We can both be wrong. There could be no God, but we can't both be right.
There's that too, right? There's that too.
Yeah. And I've never had a Muslim disagree with that characterization. See?
Right. I mean, that's I think that, and it's because what it does is, one, I think it avoids this sort of what would you call it? Passivity. In order to kind of like appease the other person,
Let's get along.
And oftentimes, I think Christians, we do tend to do that a lot, especially I don't want to say progressive Christians, but I think you know what I mean. There's sort of a kind of like a, we don't want to step over the other person.
Right.
So, but I often say that, here in the West, I think a lot of times progressive Christians, and this is like from a political standpoint, what they do is they try to ally themselves with the Muslims in order to gain their vote.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Right. You're absolutely right. And vice versa, actually. Yeah. I mean, one of the most interesting phenomenons is Islam aligning itself
Mm-hmm.
With, the whole LGBTQ movement, because
Right.
obviously, theologically and religiously, they oppose it. But in
Right.
the West, they will utilize that whole
Right.
progressive thing, to gain rights and momentum for their own cause. And there's
Exactly.
actually a term for this. It's called civilizational jihad.
Okay.
So, and if you look at the Quran is basically divided. The Quran doesn't read like the Bible. Like, there's no really historical line in terms of movement, historical movement in the Quran. Basically, there are verses that were written in Medina and there were verses that were written in Mecca. And what you see there is two different strategies at work of how Islam, depending on whether they are the majority or the minority, right? And what their strategy is and how they will interact in the culture, So when they're in the minority, those verses, are, we're all children of Abraham, we're all, we're all treat each other compassionately and so forth. But when they're in the majority, it's a whole different strategy, So the Mecca Medina thing is a very important hermeneutic in deciding, which verses are in play here. And so when they're in the minority, they know that they have to use the rules and laws of civilization in that culture in order to adapt and to change that culture. In other words, they don't use force and violence. They use the laws of the land in order to further the causes of Islam.
Right.
And that's why they're aligned with the progressives and why they're aligned, with the whole LGBTQ thing and so forth here in America, which is, which is really this kind of cognitive, disconnection there, because that's not Islam at all.
Right.
Yeah. They would never do that as the majority.
Right.
Only that as the minority.
Right. Right. And I've heard, I've heard, friends of mine and stuff like that, like, of course we don't agree, we don't, that's not, it's not spiritually sound within our tradition. Yeah. We never agree to
right.
LGBTQ, whatever it is you want to say, and most of them also wouldn't never agree to abortion,
right.
and
right.
many of the other sort of conservative values that, Americans have here, and so, I mean, there is that's a unique, it's a unique conversation once you start talking to Muslims away from sort of the broader audience, or like something like that. If you're in a university setting, they're sort of careful to toe the line. But when you're talking, as friends, like separately, over coffee, they're like, no, man, I don't agree with that crap. You know what I mean? So,
yeah, sure. Yeah.
Well, Pastor Fitzgerald, I want to thank you for joining me. This is very enlightening, and I enjoyed talking with you. I'm glad we can get some laughs.
Yeah, absolutely, Shannon. Great to meet you and great to be with you today.
Thank you so much. Well, the last thing I want to ask you is what you're planning on doing forthcoming. Like, is there anything to be on the lookout for?
Yeah, so we hold classes in Egypt twice a year, seminary classes. We founded a seminary there, and it's called New Geneva Theological Seminary. And we will be going back. I'll be going back in September, and we'll hold classes first week of October. Okay. We'll hold 3 classes in the master's program, and then we'll have 2 classes in the Doctor of Ministry program. And so that's always an important time for us. We've been there, and we founded New Geneva about 10 or 11 years ago in Egypt, and we've trained hundreds of pastors and elders and lay people, theological education, biblical and theological education. And so we'll continue that. We'll be going back there in September and October.
Okay.
Meanwhile, I'll probably This summer, I'll probably make another trip to the region, most likely back to Morocco, and then it's right now, because now finally these COVID restrictions, these pandemic restrictions are being lifted, and so we've been prevented from being in Morocco for 2 years. I just made my first trip in 2 years there in June. And then I'm hoping to go back during the summer and probably to Tunisia. We were restricted from going there for 2 years because of the pandemic. And now we're going to be able to go back. Egypt was open. We've always been able to minister in Egypt, always been able to minister in Iraq. So, there's some countries were closed because of the pandemic. Other countries were open. So that's what's up for the summer and the fall as we're looking forward.
Okay.
Then the other thing is, just to keep your audience praying for us, is that, before the pandemic, we were trying to expand every year into a different country,
Okay.
Like, for instance, we haven't been, going across North Africa. We haven't been to Algeria yet. I've had Algerian students, but I haven't physically been on the ground in Algeria. And I want to do that in the very near future. And then the second thing is Libya, which, has, all kinds of political, it's basically a failed state at this point.
Right.
But, we're wanting to get our feet on the ground in Libya as well. And then Syria is another place that we want to get on the ground.
Okay.
So if you and your audience keep that in your prayers going forward, we appreciate it.
We will. And thank you so much. You're doing a great job, and we will definitely keep you in our prayers.
Okay. Thanks, Shannon.
All right.
Bless you, brother, and have a great day.
Thank you. You too.
Okay. See you now. Bye. Yeah.